Okay, this is an inference question, so let's begin by reading the passage. Ratified by more than 90 countries, the Nagoya Protocol is an international agreement ensuring that indigenous communities are compensated when their agricultural resources, knowledge of wild plants, and animals are utilized by corporations. However, now we're contrasting. The protocol has shortcomings. Okay, we're identifying a problem with this. For example, it allows corporations to insist that their agreements with communities to conduct research on the commercial uses of the community's resources and knowledge remain confidential. Okay, so the good thing is the indigenous communities get paid by corporations for any knowledge or resources the corporations use. The bad news is that those deals are confidential, which means they're private, which means they're not open to public scrutiny. So, therefore, some indigenous advocates express concern that the protocol may have the unintended effect of not being open to the public community, which means we don't know what resources and knowledge are getting used and whether we're being paid for it properly. That would kind of be the issue. The problem is with the confidentiality, the lack of exposure and shedding light onto exactly what's being used and what's being paid for it. So let's see which answer choice fits. A, diminishing the monetary reward that corporations might derive from their agreements. So the unintended effect with diminishing the monetary reward that corporations might derive. Well, no, I doubt the indigenous advocates would care about that. The protocol may have unintended effect of limiting the research that corporations conduct on the resources of the indigenous communities. No, why would corporations limit the amount of research? I mean, that would be a problem, but that's not a problem of confidentiality versus open exposure. If they can get private deals where they don't properly compensate, they would actually do more research, not less. C, the advocates express concern protocol may have the unintended effect of, so the protocol is that their private deals may have the unintended effect of preventing independent observers from determining whether the agreements guarantee equitable compensation for the indigenous communities. Yes, if they are private, that prevents independent observers from looking. That is the problem or the shortcoming. That's the idea. Confidentiality is the problem. Therefore, it prevents independent observers. D. So I believe C is the answer. Let's check D. Discouraging indigenous communities from learning new methods for harvesting plants. Okay, that would be a problem if the indigenous communities did not learn new methods, but there's nothing about confidentiality of agreements or lack of exposure that would discourage the communities from learning new methods. That's incorrect. Okay, this is another inference question. Let's read the text and try to understand what's going on here. Laura Mulvey has theorized that in narrative film, shots issuing from a protagonist's point of view compel viewers to identify with the character. So protagonist point of view, good for impression of character. Such identification is heightened by invisible editing or editing so inconspicuous that it renders cuts between shots unnoticeable. Conversely, Mulvey proposes that this conspicuous editing or an absence of point of view should lead to an absence of identifying with the character. Shots would induce a more critical stance toward a protagonist. That makes sense. That's consistent with the above. Consider, for example, the attic scene in Hitchcock's The Birds, a conspicuously edited scene or sequence of 10 shots, few of which correspond to the protagonist's point of view. So this would be an example of conspicuous editing where we would not relate to the character. According to Mulvey's logic, this scene should affect viewers by. Okay, so we have the logic. From protagonist's point of view, we align with the character. If we don't have editing that aligns with the character's point of view, conspicuous editing as we call it, then we don't align with the character. We have a more critical stance toward the character. In Alfred Hitchcock's example, what would the result of conspicuous editing be? Well, the answer would be not align with the character. We would feel more negatively about the character. So A, obscuring their awareness of the high degree of artifice involved in constructing the montage. Wow, that sounds really complicated. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the logic we have up here, which, by the way, is pretty straightforward. It's just an example of the reasoning in the previous text. B, lessening their identification with the protagonist. So the viewers would lessen their identification with the protagonist for this Hitchcock conspicuous editing. Yes, that sounds good. If not, alienating them from the character altogether. Yes, that would be the problem with conspicuous editing. So it would be true in this case as well. I think B is going to be the answer. Let's check C and D. Compelling them, the viewers, to identify with the film's director. Okay, nothing in the text talks about identifying with director. That's simply not in there. Diverting their attention away from the film's content and towards its stylistic attributes. Again, that's not the discussion in the text above, so that's not correct. B is the answer. Okay, another logically completes the text or inference question. Let's read the text. The increased integration of digital technologies throughout the process of book creation in the late 20th and 21st century lowered the cost of book production. But here's the problem. Those decreased costs have been most significant in manufacturing and distribution, which occurs after the editing and design of the book. Okay, so the savings were not in the editing and design. So we think of a production flow. We have editing, you write, you edit, then you manufacture, and then you sell, right? So here's where all the technology benefits occurred. They did not occur for writing and editing. This suggests that in the late 20th and 21st centuries, the writing and editing costs did not improve very much, okay? So digital technologies made it easier than it had been previously for authors to write very long. Okay, no, nothing says it made authors write more easily, let alone long works. That's simply not in the passage. B, customers generally expected the cost. No customer expectations are discussed in this passage. That's immediately going to be wrong. Okay. Publishers increased the variety of their offerings. Okay, maybe they did because they could manufacture and sell things more quickly by printing more unique titles, but also printed fewer copies of each title. Okay, that's possible. I mean, that's plausible. Here's the problem. This is a plausible answer. If their costs went down, maybe they did that, but maybe they didn't. It's simply not in passage. Nothing says that. It just simply says their costs went down, which the implication is the writing and editing costs did not go down. The costs of writing and editing and designing a book were less affected by the technologies used than were manufacturing and distributing. That is the idea. D is the correct answer. Many animals, including humans, must sleep, and sleep is known to have a role in everything from healing injuries to encoding information in long-term memory. But, okay, here's the problem. Some scientists claim that from an evolutionary standpoint, deep sleep for hours at a time leaves an animal so vulnerable that the known benefits of sleeping seem insufficient to explain why it became so widespread in the animal kingdom. Okay, so sleep has some positives, some pros, and it has some cons as well. And what they claim is the pros don't outweigh the cons, so the cons are bigger. So why do we go into deep sleep? These scientists therefore imply a prolonged deep sleep is likely advantageous in ways that have yet to be discovered. Okay, so it seems that there's not enough benefit to justify the sleep, but again, we do sleep. So there's no two ways about that. So if that's true, there must be some additional benefits to sleep for survival. So there is likely ways that have yet to be discovered. This looks pretty good. I'm not quite going to circle it yet, but I think there's logic there. B, most traits perform functions that are hard to understand from an evolutionary standpoint. Okay, what does that say about the idea of sleep and the pros and cons? Nothing. C, it is more important to understand. More important? Okay, we have usually a false comparison, so I'm not sure let's see. To understand how widespread prolonged deep sleep is than to understand its function. No, again, That's not the issue, and who knows what's more important. Many traits that provide significant benefits for an animal also likely pose risks to that animal. So something other than sleep has pros and cons, like eating or something like that. Okay, but that's not what this passage is talking about. The idea is that it looks like the cons of deep sleep are bigger than the pros, yet we do deep sleep. That's the key logic here, which means there must be some benefits we are not accounting for that have yet to discover. A is the correct answer. Okay, another inference question. Let's read the text to get a sense of what the issues are. Researchers, however we pronounce that, Popfinger, model varying levels of passenger redistribution from short-haul flights, that's flights of 50 to 210 minutes, to high-speed rail trips. Planes travel faster than trains, but, a lot of buts. Air travel typically requires 3 hours of lead time for security baggage handling and boarding. That rail doesn't. So short-haul routes take similar amounts of time. So if I'm going in sort of less than 3.5 hour trip, air equals rail, okay? However, the model suggests that as rail passenger volumes approach capacity limits, long lead times emerge. So the benefit of rail is that there's less lead time. Not that it's faster, but less lead time. Here's a case where we don't get that benefit of lead time when he hit capacity limits. Therefore, for rail to remain a viable alternative to short-haul flights, they must not hit capacity limits. We need an answer that's going to show they don't hit capacity limits. A, rail systems should offer fewer long-haul routes and airlines should offer more. No, nothing says that one should do more of one and less of the other. It just says air equals rail for short-haul routes in terms of time. That says nothing about what they should do. B, rail systems may need to schedule additional trains for these routes. So the routes that hit capacity limits, if they schedule additional trains, there will be no capacity limits in theory. That looks pretty good. Let's soft circle it and move on. Security baggage handling and boarding procedures used by airlines may need to be implemented. No, if we do that, that's the opposite effect. That will change and worsen the time of rail, meaning they'll no longer be equal. So that is not what we want. D, passengers who travel by rail for these routes will need to accept, nothing here says what passengers need to accept. That's too extreme and not discussed in the text. Accept lead times that will be similar to those for air travel. Again, that's not true. Passengers' lead times are less for trains. So simply, they can't hit capacity limits to be a viable alternative. So if they add more trains to the schedule, that would avoid capacity limits. B is the answer.